right. I think we'll get started. My name is Jack Mulder. I teach in the philosophy department. Um, I'll let our panelists introduce themselves as we get started, but I'm joined by Drs. Kevin Kambo, Dr. Angela Carpenter, and Dr. Stephen Maiullo, and we'll get started soon. We just thought it'd be a good opportunity for us to kind of use our disciplines as humanists to think a little bit about the coming election and to just have a good conversation. It's one of the things we enjoy as humanists, is just kind of processing some of the issues that are going on in our world together, and thinking about how to make have good conversations that respect each other, and go from there. So without further ado, I'll get started and pose our first question, right? Which is just what's on your mind as we reflect on the present moment here, this contentious election. And I think we'll start with Steve, start with Steve Maiullo, and we'll go from there. Thanks.
Hi, everyone. So I'm Steve Maiullo, and I teach Greek and Latin courses here at Hope College. I've also had the opportunity to teach cultural heritage courses here. And, I tend to teach those courses on topics that I'm always thinking about. And one of the themes that I'm often exploring in my cultural heritage course is freedom, and how the Greeks and the Romans thought about freedom, and how they thought about freedom might have bearing for us today in our world. And I actually think the way that they thought about freedom and the way that the founding fathers of the United States thought about freedom following the Greeks and Romans might have some bearing on what's going on in our election today. So I'll give you the shortcut. If you were in my class, I would make you spend more time trying to define freedom for yourselves, but I'm going to give you the shortcut answer. The way that the Greeks and the Romans and the founding fathers of the United States thought about freedom, it's not defined by what students often think it is defined by, which is doing what I want to do when I want to do it, which is a common understanding of what freedom is. In fact, the Greeks and the Romans, particularly the political theorists of the Greeks and the Romans, thought about it in a very different way. They were thinking about freedom in terms of, how can we as a people govern ourselves apart from a king? That is, are we responsible enough to ourselves and to one another to be able to have the freedom to write our own laws and to follow our own laws and to enforce our own laws, to judge our own laws, those sorts of questions. The trouble is that human beings have this desire to not be under a king, but they are also naturally, in a way, selfish and self-interested. And one of the things that we explore in my classes in particular is how those two statements don't work easily together, right? If freedom is to be defined as self-government apart from a king, and human beings are self-interested, then we have to be thinking not just about ourselves and what's good for ourselves and our individual selves, but what might be good for our community as a whole. And so our founding fathers of the United States knew that these were big problems and that there were major disagreements between them about how to proceed with a conflict of this nature. The Greeks and the Romans at different points in their history had different experiments in self-government. Ancient Athens had a direct democracy, lasted just under maybe about 100 years or so, not much more than that. And the Romans had one that lasted a little bit longer. It was not a direct democracy, it was a republic. And they both failed spectacularly for very different reasons. And the people who wrote the Constitution, or who were thinking about after the Revolutionary War how to set up the United States, were looking to the failures of the Greeks and the Romans in very different ways and trying to understand the reasons for those failures. And we almost didn't have at the beginning of our nation a constitution at all because of these disagreements. There were people who argued for a federal government because they thought that what actually protects our freedom is having a strong and vigorous federal government that will secure our liberty by having laws and and enforcing those laws. And there were others who thought that, no, government is actually not the thing that can secure our freedom. Rather, it poses the greatest threat to it. And I'll say that both of them were correct. Both of those views are right. And, you know, we're still struggling with this battle today. If you happen to watch the presidential debate between Joe Biden and Donald Trump, they are both expressing anxieties, both of these kinds of anxieties. And I think voters are thinking about these things too. And so I'll stop talking now because I've gone on for so long, but those are just some of the things that are on my mind as a classicist as I think about the present moment.
Great, thanks, Steve. Angela, would you be willing to give us some thoughts here?
Absolutely. All right, welcome everyone. I, as a theology professor, wanted to say just a few words about how the Christian tradition has tended to think about the relationship between human politics and God's salvation, God's action within the world. This goes not quite all the way back to Steve's time, but getting pretty close to the end of the time of the Romans and St. Augustine, who had this metaphor for talking about human sphere and divine sphere as two cities. Another way of thinking about this is two kingdoms. You have a human earthly kingdom or an earthly city, and the kingdom of God, which of course is talked about in the Gospels all over the place. But Augustine picks up on this as the city of God. So a really crucial question throughout the Christian tradition for thinking about politics theologically is, what is the relationship between these two kingdoms? What's the relationship between our human earthly politics and God's rule, God's kingdom? And there's a whole range of options, but I want to talk about two extremes that I think most Christians have tended to say we can dispense with these two extremes pretty quickly, even though there have been some defenders of these. The first extreme would be to say there's really no relationship between these two. God's kingdom is a kingdom that is spiritual, otherworldly. It's not to say that God isn't interested in human affairs, but God saves us from human affairs. God's not interested in the politics of our world in a sort of constructive sense. These are separate. I won't go into why I think this is pretty easily dismissible. We can certainly talk about that if you have more questions, but that's one extreme. The other end of the spectrum that, again, there have been some defenders, but also tends to have some problems, is to say that these are ultimately the same thing. And in fact, we are to bring about in our earthly rule God's kingdom, that it's within our power to realize this now. And that these ultimately get equated with one another. So between these two extremes, there are really a range of options. And I'm just going to talk about one that I found helpful recently and connected to our current political moment. And here I'm drawing on a 20th century theologian, Bart, who was actually working in the middle of the 20th century around the time of World War II. So he had quite a lot. He's a German theologian. He had quite a lot of interesting political circumstances that he was dealing with. And Bart's way of thinking about this was to say, we should not expect, nor should we work for, the kingdom of God in our earthly moment. But instead, we should expect that human activity, whether it's culture or politics, or just our individual moral actions, these are genuinely human actions that can signify, that can point to, that can reflect the kingdom of God. We shouldn't expect them to be perfect. They're not God's action, they're not God's salvation, but we should think about them as being able to point to God's grace, to point to God's salvation. So why do I think that this might be helpful in our current moment in thinking about the relationship between faith and politics? Well, I think it allows us to say a couple of things. If you agree with Bart, if you find this helpful at all. On the one hand, I think it allows us to say we shouldn't expect any human program of politics to be perfect. And we shouldn't treat it as perfect. We shouldn't be willing as Christians to identify with a particular program and say, this is right all the way down. That way lies idolatry. We're trying to identify God's kingdom, God's path in the world as being active through a particular and narrow human range of actions. And there's something I think is very liberating about that we can work for justice in the world. We can ask how God's grace can be reflected and signified in the world without expecting it or putting the pressure on ourselves even that it has to be absolutely perfect, because that's God's job, it's not ours. But on the other hand, I think it guards or protects, and this is the last thing I'll say, I'm not quite sure how long I've been talking, I think it protects us from another pitfall, which is to say, you know what, we shouldn't talk about this at all as Christians. It's just too divisive. We agree about Jesus, and that's what really matters. But Bart wants to say, no, actually, we should expect our human action to be able to point to God, to God's kingdom, to reflect God's grace. And because of that, these issues really do matter. And these difficult conversations that we have to have sometimes within our Christian communities, whether it's about race or abortion or family separation or whatever it is, we really actually do have to have these conversations because we take seriously our calling to point to God's kingdom, to reflect God's kingdom and God's grace. All right, that's all I'll say. Thanks, Jack.
Kevin? Nelson?
Thanks, and thank you for everyone for joining us this evening. I'm Kevin Kambo. I teach in the philosophy department. My area is mainly ancient philosophy, and I spend a lot of time worrying about Platonic moral psychology, so the psychology of individuals and psychology of communities. And then outside of that, a bit of philosophy of technology. I am here, I guess, in the capacity, my capacity is, I suppose, a philosopher of ancient, or the ancient world. And to some extent, as I think the only panelist who cannot vote. So I am playing the Prince Harry role of coming to tell of foreign power, a foreign agent coming to tell you what to do and what to think about. So let's see, over the last kind of few weeks, as the election's been coming closer and closer, I think one thing that struck me more and more is, I mean, the difference between the election here in the United States and more or less how it happens in Kenya, where I'm from. Politics at home is very much a lot more about personalities, and there isn't as much ideological distance between various parties and persons. So people who are sort of on opposite sides a couple of years ago are probably campaigning together this year as they prepare for the next election and that kind of thing. It's very weird, I think, for Americans to think that that's how maybe, alliances kind of intersect. Whereas the United States is very ideological. And on the one hand, it sounds, this is philosophical and deliberate. It's about ideas. But on the other hand, ideology is a funny term because it comes from the Greek idain, which Steve can correct me about. And it's the same root word for the word idol. And the thing about idols that scripture tells us is, they have eyes but they don't see, they're blind. They're blinding in sort of interesting ways. And the more we kind of get caught up in these things, the more and more blind we become. And they tend to demand, often enough, human sacrifice. And as I watch at least the discourse in the United States play out, I'm struck very much by how people latch on to sort of philosophical ideas, and these become sort of totalizing labels in a way that if someone is a Trump voter, they are therefore racist, and if someone is a Biden voter, they're therefore baby killers. And it's this very reductionistic things where we stop kind of seeing people and we just see a sort of ideological enemy, and we want to sort of destroy this person, we want to crush this person. And I mean, even without having to get into Hume, and this is just very weak kind of reasoning from effect to cause, people are just a lot more complicated and they vote for very complicated reasons. I mean, right now in my senior SEM, we are going through, well, we just finished going through Tolkien's Two Towers. And there's a scene where one of the hobbits, Sam Gamgee, sees for the first time human beings fighting each other. It's the sort of the only time there's a kind of intra-species conflict. And it's striking to him, right? Kind of seeing this human capacity for fratricide that people sort of, because of ideology, because of these sorts of reductionistic labels, trying to destroy each other. And it's something that's been with us since, at least as far as, you know, the Hebrew Bible is concerned, Cain and Abel, right? This capacity for us to destroy each other, even though we're all human beings. And so one kind of interesting idea that I've heard recently, because I've been reading a bit of James Baldwin right now, because just the moment is, at one moment he's recounting and reflecting of how he comes to appreciate Shakespeare. And he says, one of the things that's great about Shakespeare as a poet is his capacity to, I think, destroy all labels and complicate all battles. And I think that's sort of the healthy thing to do. It's the thing we have to be trying to do, that we can't allow these sort of labels to become idols for us and sort of paint the whole world according to these colors. I mean, Shakespeare would say, right, there's a lot more in the world, right? There's more in heaven and on earth than is dreamt of in our philosophies, because in some ways, ideology is just totally reductionistic. And we have to be able to see that people are complex, that the individuals are complex, and try and understand, right, what concerns they have. And your interpretation of their actions is not necessarily, you shouldn't assume it's obviously the correct one. And so as we have this discourse, I think we need to come back to this idea of individuals are more sophisticated than the labels that we have for them, or the labels we use to interpret their actions, and have more, and that opens up room, I think, for more dialogue and discourse, because that's not really happening right now. It's more people lobbing bombs or memes at each other as a way of sort of dominating or crushing or owning. And it's lazy for the people who claim to be trying to live the life of the mind and trying to live like political animals, i.e. deliberating and sharing a common destiny.
Thanks, Kevin. I'm just going to say a few words and then we'll take some other questions. We'll do some questions. Before I get started, I might just indicate that to anybody who's joining us, once we each have something to say, then you can submit things through the Q&A button at the bottom of your screen. It's going to be, I think it's going to be better if we do the Q&A rather than the chat. So we'll try that. But yeah, just some things that I'm reflecting on in the present moment, right? For my part, I think we've got a two-party system, and my own view is that both parties are in a kind of extended identity crisis, right? When I think about the identity crisis on the left, I think about terms like liberal and progressive, right? I mean, to me, the Democratic Party, it used to be kind of the party of Rawls, whose entire political theory in his book, Political Liberalism, was essentially an extension of the principle of tolerance. Right, but liberalism was then the political theory that the government needn't take moral or religious sides, right? So for instance, liberals used to talk about abortion, for example, by saying they didn't think the government could legislate morality, right? But the tension I think now is that a lot of political questions have morally progressive answers, and there's not a lot left for liberality, right? And I think that comes in when folks in the left try to appeal for some freedom of opinion and are often sort of cast as complaining about cancel culture, right? I don't think it's that simple, right? Now, clearly some things should be canceled. Clearly racist ideas should be actively resisted, right? But many other things should be permitted in a deliberative democracy so that we can test ideas, so that we can see which ones bear up under scrutiny, right? Yeah, and I mean, for my part, I worry sometimes that, you know, when I look at a lot of sort of the evolution of Biden's views, right, sometimes they seem to bear a kind of uncanny resemblance to those of his parties, right, those of his party, and that worries me, right? And, you know, I am pro-life, right, and it worries me that there's a kind of there's kind of abortion extremism that some people have talked about more recently, and that's something that concerns me, right? But on the identity crisis on the right is something of the opposite. So like the Republican Party used to think of itself as the political expression of the Christian right. It used to be championed by an evangelical movement calling itself the moral majority, which was founded in the 1970s, came to prominence throughout the 80s, and was memorably mocked by the punk band Green Day in the song Minority in the early 2000s. In those days, the right presumed a kind of moral authority in the face of a kind of liberality it associated with moral decline. But now that its opponents are asserting their progressive cause with a kind of missionary spirit, the right often finds itself clinging to the very liberalism it so often despised. It used to police, and now it feels policed. The right's moral vision is losing popularity, and so now it often feels the need to assert only its religious freedom, hoping that the still liberal elements of the left will sympathize. But since that very liberalism is in decline on the left, panic has set in on the right. Given that panic, many on the right began to hitch their wagons to one of the most unlikely figures imaginable, the infamously libertine reality TV show star turned US President Donald Trump. At first, many held their noses and went along with them, but then they noticed that for some reason his bombast was getting the results they wanted. So now the Republican Party has refused to draw a new platform for 2020, largely because of its strong support for the Trump agenda already marked out in 2016. So again, right, the party that used to be home to the moral majority is throwing its hat in with, I don't know, seems to be a populist megalomaniac with a penchant for vulgarity, adultery, and at best, racial insensitivity. So I think both parties should think more about the bewilderment some of us rightly feel in considering their crises of identity. Moreover, Christians should think hard about the scandal that is caused by the specter a Trump presidency will cast on politics for years to come. As a Christian, I feel alienated from a party that claims to be pro-life and yet seems to care little for the poor, the immigrant, and God's own creation. And yet I also find the moral vision of the Democratic Party to be simultaneously confused about its own principles and doubling down about its own stance on issues like abortion. And since I am pro-life, I think this issue is especially grave. And so I'm personally repelled by both sides for what I think are morally good reasons. Is that a reason to choose the lesser of two evils? Maybe, right? It also could be a reason to send a message to both parties that their codependent fear-mongering needs to end. And so that's just kind of the pickle that I often find myself in, right? But yeah, let's maybe we can shift to a couple of questions, and let's see. Let's take a couple of questions maybe for us. What advice might you give to a first-time voter? Right. Maybe we can just kind of unmute ourselves a little bit, see how that goes, and open up. Right. What advice might you give to a first-time voter?
Okay, I'll start. And maybe this is in response to Jack's question, where he feels that he's in a pickle about who to choose to vote for. My advice to a first-time voter is voting is not painting, which means voting is not about expressing yourself necessarily, where you're going to find someone with whom you absolutely agree. That the way that Jack describes it is exactly what voting is like. It's always a choice between two undesirable things. And I'm of the opinion that you don't get to hide from that by voting a third party libertarian candidate or a Green Party candidate. That's actually, ignoring your responsibility to actually have to choose one or the other and you are absolutely free, all of you out there is absolutely free to disagree with anything that I'm saying here, but this is just where I am, that we do have to choose something, one of the two options, because that is what we have. In not choosing, we are actually choosing. So I'll stop there and let others speak.
I wonder if in this particular election, good advice for a first-time voter would be, who do you trust more? Instead of thinking particularly about issues, which is normally how I've approached elections, much how Jack describes, maybe this is leading more towards Kevin's description of personality-based elections instead of ideologically based elections. But this election for me is really based on who I think is more trustworthy at a really crucial time. So that'd be my advice.
So I'm not voting, so again, this is so easy for me to say something. I guess I have a general point, and then I want to push back slightly on what Steve said. Well, not slightly, I want to push back totally. So I think general good advice is consider that voting against the sort of short-term interest of your faction, and think about the long-term common good. So let me give you one potential example. Say you're a millionaire and you're making so this will be an easy one and it's relatively uncontroversial, I think. Say you're making $1 million every year, and a vote for Joe Biden presumably means you're going to pay more taxes. I think that's probably, we all think that. But I think most of us would say, if you thought that a vote for Biden is good because actually higher taxes will be better for the common good, even though my faction, my people, right, might be hurt by this in the short term, I think it's still something to consider, right? So if we're so sort of fixated on sort of factional politics that it's easy to lose sight of the common good, of this, of what are the things we actually share, which are probably more important. So that's sort of, I think, sort of uncontroversial general idea. I don't have any fight in the third party business, but I think at least for the people who are sort of inclined that way, I think there is a wisdom, a certain kind of wisdom in deciding to say neither of the two main parties. And my reasoning is this, and the story is going to come from Socrates, oddly enough. In the Apology, he tells this story of how, on the one hand, the oligarchs, the 30 tyrants of Athens, wanted him to nab some upstanding guy called Leon of Salamis and bring him to an unjust trial. And Socrates says, essentially, he's not going to do it. And he goes home, expectation that the 30 tyrants are actually going to kill him. Shortly, I think after that, there's a sort of a regime change, and the demos, the democracy is in power. And they want to put on trial these 6 admirals who were sort of negligent, let's say, at a sea battle. And they wait, and the democracy or the demos wants to put them on trial because all of them at the same time, which according to Socrates is contrary to Athenian law. They should all be tried as individuals. And so again, he refuses to sort of bring this to trial because he's sort of the guy in charge at the moment. And he assumes that they're going to kill him. So he says, I'm not going to do this, and let the chips fall where they fall. And his reasoning in both of these is sometimes evil and great evil might be inevitable. But if it's possible for you to say not through me, that's something to consider, and that's something important. And if you look at these two parties and you think either of them is going to bring significant evil, I think you can legitimately say not through me. And Steve's going to say that's throwing away the vote. But it is an important thing to consider. I just don't see this duty to accelerate something you think is actually evil. So worth thinking about.
Maybe we can try this question. Given questions about peaceful transition of power and election legitimacy, what do you think is the most important responsibility of a citizen in the days following the election? What do you think is the most important responsibility of a citizen in the days following the election? I can pick on somebody, right? Maybe Angela, you want to go for it?
Sure. Yeah, so I see a couple of issues as worth considering in advance here. One, I mean, there was just a plot to kidnap our governor, so I don't think I'm fear-mongering when I say there's a potential for violence associated with this election. So that's certainly one issue to consider. And then the other is the legitimacy of the election itself. I think we could see a number of scenarios where legal challenges after election day might try to, instead of resolving the election by counting all the votes, try to resolve it in other ways through the courts. And I think for ordinary citizens, it's like really easy to feel powerless in these situations. So I think a couple of things that as a citizen we can do to make our voice be heard. One, I'm strongly in favor of the peaceful right to protest and demonstrate. And that's something to keep in mind. If we are in a situation where it seems like the actual legitimacy of democracy is at stake, I think David Brooks wrote a column about this a few weeks ago. Republican, Democrat, independent, whatever, we should be willing to actually take a stand. So that's just something I think mentally, maybe it's a worst case scenario, perhaps an unlikely scenario, but maybe we need to mentally prepare ourselves for what we might do in that situation. A more sort of mundane approach, I think, is in the aftermath of the election, be willing to set aside our own vote, the side we wanted, and be willing to say, what does our society, the functioning of our government over the next 4 years, what does that need from us now? What is actual rule of law and legitimacy of the election in this particular circumstance? So that would be my approach.
Other folks?
I might be an outsider or an outlier here, but I'm actually not too worried about the peaceful transition of power. And the reason is that there are so many, I don't know, we have a pretty vigorous state, I think, and I don't know, ways to prevent any kind of, I don't know, tyrannical usurpation or something like that. And I know that there was an attempt to kidnap the governor of Michigan, but the FBI did stop that before anything really happened, right? So there are things that are in place that would prevent such a thing from happening. I might be naive, and you might say that, but I'm not too worried about that right now. But in the event that there are some fears about that, yeah, we are, hopefully, if things are going well, going to have to recognize that some of us might lose wherever your vote might be, and accepting that. And I understand that the way that we elect a president in this particular country through an electoral college, that is, we do not directly elect a president, through an electoral college, in which many states, with the exception of a couple, are all electoral votes go to one vote. They're not proportionately given. That there is a sense of an undemocratic way that the president is elected. So there's some resentment about that. And that's true, but that's the way it was designed for all sorts of complicated reasons. I'll stop talking. I don't want to talk too much.
Here's one from kind of the feed here. So here's a question. The two candidates talk a great deal about growing the economy even more and helping us acquire more wealth, more stuff, and produce as much as we can. This seems to go in the face of the egalitarian society that God personally involves himself in and supports over certain ways of centralized abundance and surplus. Should we really be desiring politicians who push this mindset when our world is clearly dying at an alarming rate? What do you think?
I'm going to tie it into what I said at the beginning in my opening talk. That's because we live in a society that defines freedom as license, doing what we want, getting what we want, consuming as much as we can. We're a very consumer-based society, and that's the way that we think about things. So we actually have a pretty weak understanding in the United States about what freedom actually is. You see that when we take a look at this debate over mask wearing, right? People don't want to be told by the government that they should not be wearing masks or that they need to be wearing masks for the good of everyone else. We bristle at that, at the government telling us what to do, because we don't want someone to get in the way of the stuff that we want to do, the kind of life that we are leading. We want to continue to consume more and more and more, because that's how we define our worth in this country, right? Do you have a big enough house, a big enough car? And we pursue a certain kind of lifestyle so that we can acquire these things. And we call ourselves free when we do this. But are we really, or are we just enslaving ourselves to all of these external things that appear good but are not really good? So I don't know that the president can talk in moral terms and tell people you need to consume less. That's not how you win an election, right? One doesn't moralize to win an election. The way you win an election is by saying, yes, stuff is good, consuming stuff is good. If you elect me, I will make sure that you get to consume even more stuff. Because that's how we are. Go America. Freedom.
I will say I am very sympathetic to the question. I appreciate whoever contributed it. Thank you. Maybe one way to frame this would be, could we have a national conversation about the economy that is less focused on consumption, but more focused on what we produce and how it's produced? So more focused on meaningful work rather than cheap consumption or abundant consumption. Maybe that would get us more in the direction that we would want to go in terms of thinking about sustainability and the common good. But it's also one of these questions that is so far from our current reality that you almost have like no hope of translating it into current political conversation, because like you're like Wendell Berry, you go off and have your farm and you write your books on a typewriter, but it's hard to translate into like who you should vote for, Biden or Trump. So
yeah, I mean, just to kind of jump on what they've said, basically in agreement. That question seems right. It's just sort of too late for that question in this election. We're kind of doomed in that sense. But I think it goes to an important point, which is politics isn't something you do once every 4 years. That if you're thinking about what citizenship should actually mean, it's something you're doing all the time, and we should be thinking constantly about ecologically, right? About how we're consuming, and not just sort of material things, but I mean our consumption of the internet, the news, that everything is kind of supersized and this crazy growth mindset. But if you think ecologically, you realize growth is not a value in itself, right? Cancers are growths, and they're not good growths, but they're huge. And so, right, And right now, because of this growth mindset, we're the ones sort of being farmed by these really large tech companies, and we almost can't do anything about it at this point because our politics just can't handle that kind of conversation. And by our, I mean your politics. Uh, so I think this is one of the things you wonder about. Okay, what do you do after election day, right? What does actual politics look like? And you have to realize that in many ways, your vote for what happens locally has way more significance and a lot more weight than your vote for what happens in Washington. And so what's going on in your city, and how are things being, what are the laws, how the communities, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, get involved, be educated. You can't just show up every 4 years, which I guess for every college student means it's once in your college career, you get to be political. That's kind of absurd. So yeah, I mean, you have to think about politics as being something much larger than the vote for who's president.
Let's see. According to a recent study, public opinion has virtually no effect on policy, which is controlled by the wealthiest people and corporations, right? If that's correct, what would you recommend to try to change that? Got any ideas?
I'll talk because I don't know, I unmuted myself first, not because I have a particularly good answer to this. That's exactly right. There are all these studies that suggest that the stuff that actually gets passed has to do with the way that we have money in politics. I mean, look, we don't really have, there are questions about whether or not we have, a democratic republic, or, are we a republic? How democratic are we? Really, what we have is some kind of oligarchy that's actually masquerading in these other things, right? Because it's all this money that's in politics. I mean, that's the answer. I don't know if I have a good policy answer about how to get rid of it. Humanists are not great at policy ideas. I'm not so sure, at least I'm not. I leave that to the political scientists and the economists who might be in the audience, who have some really good suggestions about this problem. So that's all I'm going to say, is that this is a major problem. It's fiercely undemocratic, and I'm not so sure that that's so good for us. And actually, I think that's part of the reason why Donald Trump was elected in 2016, far more so than any ideas that we might have that people who voted for Trump are necessarily bigoted or racist or white supremacists. Not discounting that, but I do get the sense that there's just frustration, and there was a lot of frustration with Democrats and Republicans kind of playing the same kind of games that they were playing a lot, who they're taking money from. And those things tend to get made into laws, or the laws that are beneficial to the donors. And people are just tired of that. When Donald Trump came out in 2016 and said, I'm funding myself, I'm beholden to nobody, that sounded refreshing to so many people. And so really, if we want to save a democratic form of government or a Republican form of government, money has to be at the center of the conversation.
Okay, if nobody else has anything on that one, I can shift to another question. This one says, let's see, thinking of the courts, what do you think of the confirmation in the Senate for the new Supreme Court judge? How do you think that this will affect precedent court cases? How do you think the public will react? Going off of this freedom business, how do you think this will affect the support for the government? And what can people actually do but protest? Okay. Thoughts about the, apparently the confirmation went through, so.
I'll jump in here. I don't know that it'll have any effect on this election. I think a really good case to be made is that the people who already cared about this issue are probably already voting the way they're going to vote anyway. So I don't see it as necessarily having an effect on the election. I do think it's going to have a dramatic effect on the decisions of the Supreme Court over the next several years. I mean, we're really used to a very balanced court with one swing voter. And now on the really controversial topics, there's not going to be that one swing voter. There's two swing voters. So I think, you can expect a lot of decisions on voting rights, or going back to the issue on money in politics, for example. Citizens United, of course, is another one of these really controversial, closely decided Supreme Court cases. Roe versus Wade, obviously. So yeah, I think it could have a really dramatic effect on our jurisprudence. There's a lot to that question, so I'm not sure I'm touching on all the aspects of it. But I mean, my own perspective in terms of the legitimacy of the decision is that it made sense for either the Merrick Garland nomination to be stopped, or for this one to be continued, but not both of those. So that's my perspective.
Yeah, I mean, I think I agree just about pretty much most of what Angela said. I don't think, anyone's going to feel anything different about how they're already feeling, at least as far as the election is concerned. That being said, conservative justices are a funny species. The court has, on social issues, pretty much drifted left. I think I saw a statistic earlier today saying something along the lines of, if Amy Coney Barrett goes through 15 of the last 19 or so vacancies were filled by a Republican president. So if that being the case, they've still, quote unquote, delivered on, social issues on the left. So I think conservative justices are more likely to be conservative on money things and power things, which probably means they're more libertarian than conservative at the end of the day. So yeah, if you're sort of a social conservative, you're probably, I mean, it's hard to predict what's going to happen. If you're libertarian, you're probably pretty happy. And if you're sort of more communitarian, you're probably more disturbed, and that's going to become more of a block. Liberal justices tend to vote more as a block. Conservative justices is there's significant more some ideological complexity. So, I don't know, but I think part of the larger problem is, as we all know, the legislature doesn't do much, and so it's kind of rule through Supreme Court and rule through executive order and executive agencies, and that's just not healthy. So if laws were actually passed by the legislature, I think that would restore some balance to these things, but I don't think any of us is expecting that to happen anytime soon. But I mean, statistically, it seems Biden's going to take the Senate, the House, and probably win, so that might change things, at least in the short term. So yeah.
Kevin, I want to say more about what you said about the legislator, just so that everyone in the audience understands what you're getting at, right? So there was actually quite a debate around the founding of the country over the Supreme Court and whether or not this was a good thing. Those who were opposed to having a federal government or for enacting a constitution and wanted to keep a confederacy of states were really worried that the judiciary would not be accountable to the people. I mean, they were going to be they would be nominated by a president, and then they would be confirmed by a Senate. And at the time, the Senate members of the Senate were not directly elected by the people. They were elected in a different way through state governments, state legislatures. So there was real worry that having a judiciary with the power to overturn laws that the people's actual representatives would enact would seriously damage self-government. And I actually think that there is something to that argument as we see it in 2020, because we have a president who lost the popular vote, even though he won the Electoral College, able to put through 3 Supreme Court justices who were confirmed by a Senate, and the Senate is a Republican majority, even though fewer Americans voted for Republican senators, right? Because we have, North Dakota, South Dakota, Wyoming, Montana, there's like 8 senators there, and they have not the same number of people that are in California, which has 2, right? So there's a question about whether or not the Supreme Court actually reflects the very same, actually reflects the electorate in a way. And the electorate is supposed to be the ones who are electing people to the House and the Senate to enact law. And we're not enacting law anymore. We're leaving so much to the Supreme Court. So are we giving up, when we do this, paying attention to the court, not demanding that our representatives enact laws? Are we giving up some of that self-government and that freedom that I tried to talk about at the beginning? So I agree with everything Kevin said. I just wanted to flesh it out a little bit.
By the way, just as we're passing through this question, I for what it's worth, I totally agree with Angela. In fact, I would go a little bit further on the Supreme Court thing, which is to say, I think Merrick Garland should have been confirmed, because I think it's just hopelessly tendentious to try to say this is the time at which a president should no longer bring forward, right, a nominee to, a president should just bring forward a nominee while the president still has the power to do that, right? That's why I think, Merrick Garland should have been confirmed, right? But, it's obviously a mess right now. But anyway, let me bring that back to a question here. Let's see. Oh, there's one worth, so here's a question. It says, how much do you think President Trump's passage of increased funding for historically Black colleges and universities has improved race relations in the USA? If anybody's got something they want to say about that, by all means. One thing I just want to say to that question is that in a preview of coming attractions, there's a panel on Wednesday at 7:30, specifically devoted to the issue of this coming election and race. So would anyone like to chime in on that before we kind of pass that to the next panel? Or
Oh, I can jump in on it real quick. I think in another political environment, this is the sort of thing that might have been really well received as an overture. But there's been so much else, and I'm sure that's what the panel on Wednesday will spend all of its time talking about. There's been so much else, just really lightning rod stuff on racial questions all throughout the Trump presidency, that it's hard to see that this one action would have that much of an effect on public opinion. But yeah.
Okay. So here's a question. As Christians, should we try to vote for politicians with whom we morally agree, even if they seem like a weak leader, or should we vote for the stronger leader, but someone who is weaker morally?
It's hard for me to imagine as a Christian a leader that I would agree with on everything, right? So, I'm thinking about people who might be attracted to vote for Donald Trump because he has passed through, or he has gotten through some pro-life judges, and that's a good thing. But as I think, Jack, you mentioned this in your opening little address, what does that mean for the 200,000 Americans that have died of the coronavirus, right? Do these things offset one another? Do the unborn matter more than those who are old, for whom there might not be a sufficient response? So I'm not so sure that I as a Christian can find a candidate that I think is enacting my idea of what Christian values are fully. So what do I do with that tension, right? That's the thing. One of the things that I, as a humanist, try to do is to stop thinking about people and candidates in terms of good guys and bad guys, like Christian enough, not Christian enough. I think that we are all complicated messes in a variety of ways, and we have some angels in us and we have some demons in us. And how do we learn to live with those contradictory things? That's part of being an adult, is learning to keep things that are contradictory in your, that are contradictory in your head at the same time and not totally explode. And so I think that that's one of the things that we as Christians are trying to work with this election. I'll let others.
Yeah, I'm not sure if I 100% understand the question, but hopefully this is relevant. So if you're thinking of voting for someone who's strong, but who's morally weak, granted, we were asked from sort of Christian perspective, but I'm going to give a Platonic answer. For Plato, and I think this would work for Augustine too, there's this idea that the corruption of the best, or the corruption of the strong, is the worst thing that can happen in the city. And so if you have someone who's strong and convincing, charismatic, and so on and so forth, but is morally off, that's something actually very dangerous for the common good. And I think when you're voting, I think really the common good should be the primary thing you have in sight. And so if someone is weaker, let's say, but is actually going to, for example, be better for the institution and the stability of the polis or the nation or something like that, I think it makes way more sense to vote for such a person rather than, right, because I just don't understand the attraction for someone who is strong but morally perverse. That just seems to be, voting for your own extinction almost. Bring on the meteor and let's see where it falls. So right, what serves the common good? What serves the institution? What serves rule of law? I think those are the things you want to have in mind rather than strength.
Yeah, I could just piggyback off that a little bit. It reminded me of how many times the president has lauded another international figure for being strong, and they're all, authoritarian strong men who we would certainly not want ruling any country or leading any country. So yeah, just to second that idea, although I also want to push back just a little bit on the expectation of perfection, because I think that's a trap as well. I think we also have to realize that our leaders are going to have moral failings, and that's going to be something that we have to consider when we vote for someone. There is no perfect person for whom to vote. And often we are not going to know even the worst moral failings of the person that we're voting for. So it's more of a caution against the expectation that my vote is this morally perfect action that can be pure in some sense, which I think we've all been trying to resist in one way or another.
All right, I think we're gonna have to make this the last question. It's this, given the possibility of violence after the election, indeed some would say the high probability of violence, how should Christians respond? Should we follow the just war criteria to determine when and why violence is justified? Or should Christians follow the witness of pacifists from the early church to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. and disavow all forms of violence? Go.
That's not a loaded question, Jack. I am skeptical that there's a high probability of significant violence. I mean, there probably will be some violence, but I doubt it's going to be sort of national level. I think right now we're sort of in a pot of anxiety, and there are people whose professions sort of are parasitic on the need for anxiety in the polis or in the community. That being said, I guess my quick answer would be, I think it's a question of authority, right? So do not take the authority of the state into your hands and get into the street and start fighting. There are, at least at this moment, legitimate channels that we all recognize as channels through which the election will be ratified and confirmed and so on and so forth. And you come down, you consent to those determinations. And if the only kind of violence I would conscience is the violence to sort of maintain the legitimacy of those sorts of things, not just but yeah, I mean, legitimate agents of the state, I think, should do that rather than I'm going to go outside and throw some rocks.
Can I jump in on that one second? Right. Whoops. So yeah, I mean, I remember asking someone, what he thought of the result of the 2016 election shortly after it happened. And for some reason, I expected him to say it was a disaster, and I still suspect he would not have, voted for Trump. But what he actually said surprised me. He said the system worked. Right? People voted, their candidate won, there was a new president, right? And as important as this election is, it's still kind of a remarkable thing that we can vote and have the reasonable expectation, within it's just defeasible, but fairly reasonable expectation that our vote will be counted. And we want that to remain true. And the only way it will remain true is if we're all committed to the realities of our system, right? We never get everything we want. But it's better that we can choose, persuade, and try again, right? And I just think, it's also worth pointing out, at least in response to the question, that you may not need to choose between the sort of pacifist response and the just war criteria, because the authority that Kevin just invoked, competent authority, is usually the first condition for just war, right? And since we're not going to, people sort of getting out in the street and throwing rocks doesn't meet that very first condition for just war theory anyway, right? It's not a question of picking one or the other. Both of those theories would condemn that kind of action. Other folks?
I might be the outlier here based on our discussion about an earlier question as well as this one. I do think there's a chance for violence, not widespread, but I think what's more likely is individual incidents of violence that are local, but that's still really scary and worth thinking about how we as citizens might respond to if we experience those sorts of pockets of violence. It's certainly been a year where we have seen that kind of violence already, and I think a lot will depend on how the person who has to concede the election ends up going about that. So maybe I'm a little more pessimistic on this point, which is unusual. I usually consider myself an optimist. But I do think it's at least something that's worth thinking about. What would you do in your community if there were pockets of violence after the election? I agree that an ordinary citizen responding with violence doesn't have the authority to do that. But I do think that there are other ways that we can take action in those situations, from peaceful protest and simply speaking out. So
I'm with you, Angela. I do think that there's a possibility for violence, because I'm going to cite the example that you gave earlier on, right? About the governor, the attempt to kidnap the governor of the United States, and knowing that the United States, we are the gun country. When I go to Italy, take students to Italy, they imagine like Americans as either living in New York or from Texas with the big hat and the guns and the holster, and they're spinning it around. Like that's what the world in some senses thinks about Americans. I don't know, maybe Kevin, I don't know if this is what it's like in Kenya, but it certainly is in some parts of Europe that I've gone to. So we do know that there are some crazy people who are unstable. I shouldn't say crazy, who are unstable people who have access to some pretty significant weapons that could result in something quite tragic. We have mass shootings all the time in the United States, and we have not developed the tools with which to handle those in any serious way. Again, coming back to questions about the failures of our legislature, there's one. So there are some significant worries. I don't know that I don't think that the answer is to go out with your guns and start shooting, and we'll be going down the street necessarily and starting a war with people who are shooting, but it is a worry. I'm worried about it too, Angela.
Happy question to end on, Jack.
It would be worth just kind of thinking through, right, the fact that on the one hand, sure, there's a reality that people could be quite upset, right, one way or the other, right, and we want to think through how to respond to that, which is what the questioner was asking, but it's also true for us to that we want to think through how to live out the gospel, right, and we want to think through how to insofar as it's possible for us, live at peace with folks, right, and so yeah, but I know we've got to finish up here, right, and I'm sure, I suspect anyway that if folks want to continue the conversation with anybody, we're pretty easy to find at Hope, right? But once we finish the call, it's going to finish for everybody. So just be aware of that, right? And I'm just want to thank our participants here, Angela and Kevin and Steve, and yeah, so thanks for the opportunity to everybody who's in attendance here, and yeah, have a good night.
Thanks, everyone. Thanks for your questions.
Thank you. Have a good night.
Thanks.